The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the penthouse hallway like a gunshot, freezing everyone in the room instantly. A terrified woman in a crisp gray uniform was already backing away toward the elevator, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse to her chest, looking at the small, 5-year-old girl standing amidst the ruins of a Ming Dynasty vase with absolute terror in her eyes. The little girl, Lily, didn't flinch, didn't cry, and didn't look sorry. She just stared with cold, dark eyes that seemed too old for her face, waiting for the inevitable shouting that always followed. James Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Corp. And the most feared man in Manhattan's business district, pinched the bridge of his nose as the elevator doors dinged open, signaling the end of yet another failure, making this the 99th nanny to flee his home in less than 3 years. "I can't do this anymore, Mr. Sterling," the woman stammered, her voice cracking as she stepped backward into the safety of the lift. She's not a child, she's a monster." And with that, the door slid shut, leaving James alone in the deafening silence of his multi-million-dollar prison. He looked down at his daughter, his heart aching with a mixture of frustration and a deep, burying grief that he refused to acknowledge. But before he could even open his mouth to scold her, Lily turned on her heel and marched back to her room, slamming the door with a finality that echoed in his bones. This is the story of a broken man and a woman who lost everything. And before we see how their worlds collide, hit that subscribe button to join the Folktale CEO family for your daily dose of romance and revenge. James pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing the number for the Golden Registry, the most exclusive domestic staffing agency in New York, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl as he spoke. "It happened again. Find me another one. I don't care about the cost. Just find someone who can survive her." But he didn't know that the only person who could save them wasn't on any VIP list. She was currently sitting on a park bench in the rain, crying over a divorce paper that had just ruined her life. Delilah sat on a cold, wet wood of the bench in Central Park, the ink on the document in her hand beginning to run as the drizzle turned into a steady, freezing downpour that matched the storm raging inside her chest. Just 2 hours ago, she had stood in a sterile courtroom and watched her husband, no, her ex-husband, walk away with everything, leaving her with nothing but debt and a suitcase of clothes because her lawyer had been incompetent and his had been ruthless. She wiped a tear from her cheek, smearing mascara across her pale skin, and looked up at the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan surrounding the park, feeling like they were closing in to crush her. She had no degree that mattered anymore, no references that weren't 5 years old, and now no home, because the prenup she had foolishly signed out of true love had left her destitute. A gust of wind ripped the paper from her hand, sending it tumbling across the wet pavement, but she didn't even have the energy to chase it. She just watched it dissolve into the mud, a perfect metaphor for the last 5 years of her life. Her stomach rumbled, a painful reminder that she hadn't eaten since yesterday, forcing her to stand up on shaky legs and clutch her thin coat tighter around her shivering frame. She remembered the flyer she had seen on a community board earlier that morning, a listing for an open call at the registry downtown, a place that usually required appointment-only referrals for high-end domestic staff, but was apparently desperate for temporary cleaners. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of when she was top of her class in early childhood development, but survival didn't care about dreams. Delilah took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of wet asphalt and hopelessness, and began the long walk toward 57th Street, unaware that every step she was taking was bringing her closer to a collision that would shatter her reality and rebuild it into something unrecognizable. The waiting room of the Golden Registry was silent, intimidating, and smelled of expensive lavender and judgment. James Sterling stormed through the glass double doors, dragging a reluctant Lily by the hand, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the room as the receptionists straightened their blazers and typed furiously to look busy. He was a man carved from marble and ice, his tailored suit worth more than most people's cars. But his eyes were tired, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them, betraying the sleepless nights he spent worrying about a daughter who hadn't spoken a full sentence to him in months. "Mr. Sterling, we weren't expecting you personally," the agency director, a sharp-faced woman named Miss Vance, said, as she rushed out of her office, her heels clicking nervously on the polished floor. James ignored the pleasantries, looking down at Lily, who was currently glaring at a perfectly manicured fern as if she wanted to set it on fire. "The last one lasted 40 minutes, Miss Vance," his voice low and devoid of patience. "You promised me the best, and you sent me someone who cried because a 5-year-old looked at her wrong." Miss Vance swallowed hard, gesturing for them to follow her into the private office, but Lily dug her heels into the carpet, refusing to move. James sighed, crouching down to her level, his expensive trousers straining against the fabric. "Lily, please," he whispered, a rare crack in his armor showing. "We just need to find someone to help us." But Lily just pulled her hand away, her lower lip trembling with a mixture of anger and a sorrow so deep it looked terrifying on a child's face. She didn't want a nanny. She wanted the mother who had walked out on them 2 years ago without a backward glance. James stood up, his face hardening back into the mask of the CEO, and turned to Miss Vance. "Bring out whoever is available. I want interviews now. I'm not leaving until I have a contract signed." Delilah burst through the service entrance of the building, soaked in the bones and gasping for breath, her hair plastered to her forehead in chaotic waves that made her look like a drowned rat compared to the polished candidates sitting in the main lobby. She had been directed to the wrong floor, the service elevator for the cleaning crew, but in her confusion and desperation, she stumbled into the wrong hallway. She wasn't supposed to be near the VIP client suites. She was supposed to be in the basement filling out forms for a janitorial position. As she turned the corner, she saw a line of women, nannies, sitting on velvet chairs, all of them looking terrified as they exited a large mahogany door, one by one. Some of them flushed, others looking relieved to be rejected. Delilah froze, realizing her mistake and turned to leave, but the heel of her worn-out shoe caught on the edge of the carpet. She stumbled, crashing into a small table that held a crystal pitcher of water, sending it smashing to the floor with a noise that rivaled the vase from the morning. The door to the office flew open. James Sterling stood there, looking thunderous, ready to fire whoever had made the noise. But his eyes landed on Delilah. She was a mess, soaked wet, chaotic, and completely inappropriate for this environment. He was about to order security to escort her out when movement caught his eye. Lily, the girl who hadn't moved from the corner of the office for an hour, the girl who hated everyone, walked slowly out of the room and approached the soaking wet woman on the floor. The entire hallway went deadly silent as the little girl stopped inches from Delilah. Miss Vance gasped, stepping forward to pull the child away from the dirty intruder, but James held up a hand, stopping her. He watched, fascinated and confused, as Lily stared at Delilah's face. Delilah, despite the pain in her hand and the humiliation burning her cheeks, didn't pull away. Instead, she softened, her maternal instincts overriding her embarrassment. She ignored the powerful man looming over her and looked directly at the child. "Hi there," Delilah whispered, her voice shaking but warm. "I'm making a bit of a mess, aren't I?" She smiled, a genuine, sad, beautiful smile that reached her eyes. Lily tilted her head. For the first time in 2 years, the darkness in the child's eyes seemed to clear, replaced by a flicker of recognition, or perhaps a desperate projection of hope. Lily reached out with a small, hesitant hand and touched Delilah's wet cheek, wiping away a raindrop that looked like a tear. James felt his breath hitch in his throat. Lily never touched anyone. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on as the little girl opened her mouth, her voice rusty from disuse but clear as a bell in the silent corridor. She didn't say, "Who are you?" or "Go away." She looked deep into Delilah's eyes, saw the pain that mirrored her own, and whispered the one word James thought he would never hear again. "Mom?" The word hung in the air, heavy and electric, shattering James' composure completely. Delilah froze, her heart stopping, realizing the gravity of the mistake. But before she could correct the child, Lily threw her arms around Delilah's soaked coat, burying her face in the wet coat, sobbing as if she had finally found her lifeline. James stood there paralyzed, watching a stranger hold his daughter, realizing with a jolt of terror and exhilaration that he couldn't let this woman leave, no matter who she was.
The silence that followed the word "mom" was shattered by the frantic clicking of Miss Vance's heels as she lunged forward, her face twisted in a panic that seemed disproportionate to the situation, grasping at Lily's arm with manicured claws to pry the child away from the soaking wet stranger. "Lily, sweetie, no, that's just a cleaner," Miss Vance hissed, her voice dripping with disdain as she looked at Delilah's mud-stained coat. But the moment her fingers touched the girl, Lily unleashed a scream so primal and piercing that it cracked the polished veneer of the agency wide open. It wasn't a tantrum, it was the sound of a wounded animal defending its only safe harbor. Delilah instinctively tightened her arms around the trembling child, glaring up at the agency director with a ferocity that surprised even herself, pulling the girl closer into her damp embrace as if daring the woman to touch her again. James Sterling watched the scene unfold with eyes that were usually cold and calculating, but now they were wide with shock, his mind racing to process the impossible reality that his daughter, who hadn't hugged a living soul since the funeral, was clinging to this woman like she was oxygen. "Let her go, Miss Vance," James commanded, his voice low but cutting through the chaos like a blade, stopping the director in her tracks. He stepped closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the scent of rain and despair clinging to Delilah. "She isn't leaving," he said, not to the agency staff but to the universe, making a decision that defied all logic but felt like the only way to stop his world from bleeding out. He looked down at Delilah, who was still kneeling in the puddle of water and broken glass, trembling not from the cold anymore, but from the sheer intensity of the man looming over her. "What is your name?" he asked. And when she whispered Delilah, he didn't ask for a resume, he didn't ask for references, and he didn't care about the mud on his floor. He simply extended a hand to pull her up, unaware that lifting her out of the wreckage was about to pull him into a storm far more dangerous than the one raging outside. 20 minutes later, Delilah found herself sitting in the back of a Rolls-Royce Phantom that smelled of leather and isolation, the city of New York blurring past the tinted windows in streaks of gray and neon. She was shivering, wrapped in a dry towel James had produced from a hidden compartment, while Lily sat pressed against her side, fast asleep, clutching Delilah's hand with a grip so tight her knuckles were white. James sat opposite them, watching her with the intensity of a predator studying a new species, an open folder on his lap that Delilah knew contained absolutely nothing about her, because she hadn't even filled out the application form. "You're not a nanny," James stated, not a question, but a fact, his eyes scanning her worn-out shoes and the cheap fabric of her dress beneath the towel. "No," Delilah admitted, her voice hoarse. "I was there for the cleaning job. I need money, badly." She waited for him to stop the car and kick her out, to tell her she was a fraud. But instead, he leaned forward, invading her personal space with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "I don't care if you're a cleaner, an astronaut, or a fugitive," James said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "You are the only thing that has made my daughter stop screaming in 2 years. I am offering you a job. Live in, 24/7, $100,000 a year." Delilah choked on the air, her eyes widening in disbelief. I can't accept that. I don't know how to be a governess for a billionaire," she stammered, thinking of her ex-husband's voice telling her she was worthless, incompetent, nothing. "You don't need to be a governess," James interrupted, his gaze shifting to the sleeping child, softening for a fraction of a second before hardening again. "You just need to be whatever she thinks you are." He pulled a contract from his briefcase, a gold pen resting on top. "Sign it and your debts disappear. Sign it and you have a home. But know this, Delilah." He paused, locking eyes with her. "Once you enter my house, you don't leave until I say so. This isn't just a job. It's a custody of her heart." The Sterling penthouse wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum of glass and steel floating above the clouds, silent, cold, and breathtakingly lonely. As the private elevator doors slid open, Delilah stepped into a foyer larger than the entire apartment she had shared with her ex-husband, her footsteps echoing on the black marble floor like intruders in a tomb. The walls were lined with abstract art that looked angry and sharp, devoid of any warmth or color, a perfect reflection of the man who owned them. Lily, who had woken during the ascent, immediately tightened her grip on Delilah's hand, dragging her away from James and towards a long, shadowy corridor. "Her room is this way," James said, watching them go. "Dinner is at 7. Do not be late." He turned and walked toward his study, closing the heavy oak door with a click that sounded like a lock engaging, leaving Delilah alone in the vastness of the apartment with a child she barely knew. Lily pulled her into a room that was shocking in its contrast, pink, fluffy, and filled with enough toys to stock a department store, yet it felt abandoned, the dolls sitting on shelves in perfect, untouched rows. "Mommy, stay," Lily whispered, pointing to the bed, and Delilah's heart broke all over again. She realized then that this wasn't just a spoiled rich kid. This was a child starving for affection in a castle made of ice. As Delilah sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the hair of the little girl who believed a lie, she caught her reflection in the mirror. A fraud, a divorced failure wearing a billionaire's towel, and she knew she was walking a tightrope over a canyon of secrets. She didn't know that the biggest secret wasn't hers. It was buried in the room next door, behind a locked door that no nanny was ever allowed to open, a room that held the truth about what happened to the real mother. Night fell over Manhattan like a heavy velvet curtain, bringing with it a thunderstorm that rattled the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. James sat in his study, a glass of amber whiskey untouched on his desk, staring at a photograph frame that was turned face down. He was trying to work, trying to bury himself in the acquisition numbers of a rival tech firm, but the silence of the house was different tonight. It felt charged, expectant. Suddenly, a scream tore through the apartment. Not the angry screams he was used to, but a terrified shriek of a nightmare. James knocked his chair back, sprinting down the hallway, his heart hammering in his chest, ready to fire Delilah for letting his daughter cry, ready to throw her out into the rain. He burst into Lily's room, breathless, but he froze in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame so hard his knuckles turned white. The room was dim, lit by a nightlight, and Delilah was sitting in the center of the bed, rocking a sobbing Lily back and forth, her chin resting on the child's head. She wasn't panicking. She was humming. A low, haunting melody that James hadn't heard in years, a song that twisted a knife in his gut. "Hush now. The storm is just the sky clapping for you," Delilah whispered, repeating the words she'd invented for the children she never had, unaware that James was watching her with a look of utter devastation. Lily's sobbing quieted into soft hiccups, and then silence. She was asleep. Delilah looked up, her eyes meeting James across the room. In the dim light, she looked ethereal, glowing with a warmth that this house had tried to extinguish. For a second, James didn't see the poor girl from the registry. He saw a ghost. He stepped back into the shadows, his breathing ragged, and walked away before he did something stupid like fall to his knees and thank her. But as he retreated to his cold bedroom, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "It's Sterling. Run a background check on Delilah Ross. I want to know everything. Who she was, who she married, and why she looks at my daughter like she's lost her too." The next morning, the sun brutally illuminated the lies of the night before. Delilah woke up with a stiff neck, curled up at the foot of Lily's bed, and for a split second, she forgot where she was, until she saw the Manhattan skyline through the window and remembered she was the property of James Sterling. She quickly straightened her clothes, panic setting in as she realized she had slept in her uniform, and hurried to the kitchen, hoping to make breakfast before anyone woke up. But James was already there. He was sitting at the massive granite island, drinking black coffee, a thick manila envelope sitting unopened in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his face unreadable, his eyes tracking her movement as she nervously reached for the kettle. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice smooth but laced with hidden tension. "Yes, sir. Lily, she had a bad dream," Delilah replied, avoiding his gaze. James tapped his finger on the envelope. "I know. I heard you singing." The air in the kitchen dropped 10 degrees. Delilah froze. "I'm sorry, I just..." "Don't apologize," James cut her off, standing up and picking up the envelope. He walked over to her, stopping inches away, close enough that she could smell the coffee and danger radiating off him. "I have your file, Delilah," he whispered, holding the envelope up between them. Delilah's blood ran cold. The file would tell him about the divorce, the debt, the humiliating public rejection by her ex-husband, the fact that she was technically homeless. "Mr. Sterling, please, I can explain," she began, tears pricking her eyes. But James didn't open it. He stared at her, searching for deceit but finding only fear. "My investigators told me your ex-husband threw you out because you were insufficient," James said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Delilah flinched, as if slapped. "He was a fool," James said, tossing the unopened envelope into the trash can with a decisive thud. "But his loss is my gain. Don't let me down, Delilah, because unlike him, I don't discard things that are mine." He turned and walked out, leaving Delilah breathless, terrified, and strangely, confusingly, hopeful. But she didn't see the text message light up on James's phone as he left the room. "Sir, there's something else about her. Check page 4. She's not just divorced. She's connected to the accident."
James stood in the hallway, the phone burning a hole in his hand, the text message from his private investigator acting like a viral infection spreading through his veins. "She's connected to the accident." The words blurred his vision, turning the golden morning light of the penthouse into a sickly gray. He watched Delilah through the open kitchen door. She was laughing, actually laughing, as she wiped chocolate off Lily's cheek, a sound that should have been music to his ears but now sounded like a siren. Was she a plant, a spy sent by his enemies? Or worse, was she someone seeking forgiveness for a sin she hadn't confessed? James shoved the phone into his pocket, his face hardening into a mask of granite, burying the gratitude he had felt 10 minutes ago under layers of cold, calculated suspicion. He wouldn't fire her. Not yet. He needed to know the truth, and to get the truth, he had to keep her close, like a spider wrapping its prey in silk. He walked into the kitchen, the temperature dropping instantly. "Get the girl ready," he commanded, his voice devoid of the warmth he had shown the night before, startling Delilah so much she nearly dropped the spoon. "We have the admissions interview at St. Jude's in an hour. If she fails this because of your incompetence, the contract is void." Delilah looked at him, hurt flashing in her amber eyes, confused by the sudden shift from the man who had defended her to this tyrant. But she nodded, swallowing her pride. "Yes, sir," she whispered, taking Lily's hand, unaware that the interview wasn't the test. James was the test, and he was waiting for her to slip up. The wardrobe room was bigger than Delilah's old apartment, filled with rows of designer dresses that still had the tags on them, ghosts of the mother who wasn't there. Lily sat on the floor in her underwear, screaming, kicking away a stiff navy blue velvet dress that cost $2,000. It hurts, the child wailed, her skin turning red from scratching. Delilah knelt down, inspecting the dress, and realized the problem wasn't the fit, it was the fabric. Itchy, stiff, and suffocating, just like this house. "I'm not wearing it," Lily screamed, throwing a shoe that narrowly missed Delilah's head. Any other nanny would have forced her or called the father, but Delilah saw the panic in the little girl's eyes, the fear of being squeezed into a mold she didn't fit. Delilah grabbed a pair of scissors from the sewing table. Lily stopped screaming, watching with wide eyes. "Then we change the rules," Delilah whispered, winking. She grabbed a soft white cotton t-shirt from the pajama drawer and the expensive velvet dress. With steady hands, she cut the lining out of the dress, sewing the soft cotton inside, transforming the torture device into a cloud. She worked fast, her fingers flying, a skill she learned mending her own clothes when she couldn't afford new ones. 10 minutes later, Lily stood in front of the mirror wearing the dress. She spun around, realizing it didn't itch. For the first time, she looked like a princess, not a prisoner. "You fixed it," Lily breathed, looking at Delilah with awe. "We fixed things together," Delilah smiled, unaware that James had been watching from the doorway the entire time, his suspicion warring with a begrudging respect he didn't want to feel. St. Jude's Academy was less a school and more a fortress for the elite, a place where bloodlines mattered more than grades. The courtyard was filled with mothers who looked like supermodels, judging everyone over the rims of their sunglasses. Delilah walked beside Lily, feeling painfully out of place in her simple gray dress, clutching the child's hand to hide her own trembling. James walked ahead of them, parting the crowd like a shark moving through a school of fish. Suddenly, a voice cut through the murmur of polite conversation. Well, if it isn't the widower. A tall, striking woman with platinum blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes stepped in front of James. It was Veronica, a socialite who had been trying to become the next Mrs. Sterling since the day of the funeral. Her eyes flicked to Delilah, scanning her cheap shoes and messy bun with a sneer of disgust. "And who is this? Another babysitter for the difficult child?" Veronica laughed, a cruel, tinkling sound. "James, darling, when will you give up? Lily isn't cut out for this world. She's too broken." Lily shrank back, hiding behind Delilah's legs. Delilah felt a surge of rage so hot it nearly blinded her. She didn't care who this woman was. She stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. "She isn't broken," Delilah said, her voice shaking but loud enough to silence the nearby chatter. "She's grieving, and she has more dignity in her little finger than you have in your entire plastic personality." The courtyard went deadly silent. Veronica gasped, her face turning pink. James turned slowly, looking at Delilah. He should have fired her on the spot for insulting a board member's wife. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. The interview went surprisingly well, mostly because Lily refused to let go of Delilah's hand, answering the headmaster's questions with a quiet confidence she had borrowed from her new protector. Back at the penthouse, the adrenaline wore off, leaving Delilah exhausted. James had disappeared into his study immediately upon return. the ice returning to his demeanor as if the moment in the courtyard never happened. Delilah wandered down the hallway, intending to go to the kitchen, but she stopped in front of the forbidden door, the room next to Lily's. The door was heavy oak, locked with a digital keypad. James had explicitly forbidden her from even looking at it, but something pulled her toward it, a strange magnetic pull she couldn't explain. She noticed the keypad was worn on 4 specific numbers, 1, 0, 2, 8. A date? October 28th. Without thinking, her hand reached out. She didn't type the code, she just brushed her fingers against the wood. Suddenly, the door clicked. It wasn't locked. James must have left it unlatched in his distraction. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she should walk away. Opening this door was immediate termination. But the mystery of the accident and the ghost that haunted this house was too strong. Delilah pushed the door open just an inch. The smell of stale perfume and dust drifted out. She peeked inside. It was a master bedroom frozen in time. Clothes thrown on the chair, a book open on the nightstand. And there, on the wall, was a massive portrait of a woman. A beautiful woman with dark hair and Lily's eyes. Delilah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew this woman, not from the news, not from magazines. She knew her from before. "Get out." The voice was a low growl, vibrating with a rage so intense it felt physical. Delilah spun around to find James standing at the end of the hallway. He wasn't the cool CEO anymore. He was a beast, his eyes wild with fury. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, slamming the door shut right in her face, narrowly missing her nose. He grabbed her arm, not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to trap her. He backed her against the wall. Delilah was shaking, tears streaming down her face not from fear of him, but from the shock of the photo. "I know her," Delilah whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "James, I know who she is." James froze, his grip tightening. The air in the hallway crackled with the energy of the secret breaching the surface. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I saw her," Delilah cried. 5 years ago, at the hospital, the night my life fell apart, she was there." James's face went white. The text message from the morning rushed back to him, connected to the accident. He looked at Delilah, searching her face for the lie, but found only a terrified, confused truth. He let go of her arm as if burned. "You were there?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You were at the crash?" Delilah nodded slowly, the memory she had repressed for years clawing its way back. "I called the ambulance," she whispered. "I held her hand while she died."
The hallway spun around James. The air in the penthouse, usually filtered and temperature-controlled, suddenly felt thick with the exhaust fumes and rain of that night 5 years ago. He leaned against the wall, sliding down slowly until he was sitting on the floor, the mighty CEO reduced to a pile of expensive fabric and raw nerves. "Tell me," he rasped, staring at the floor, unable to look at her. "Tell me everything." Delilah sank down beside him, not touching him, but close enough to share the warmth of her presence in the freezing corridor. "It was raining, just like today," she began, her voice trembling as the memory washed over her. "I was walking home from my shift at the diner. I heard the tires screech before I saw the headlights. The car, it didn't just crash, James. It spun out like something broke." She took a shaky breath. "I ran to her. The driver was already gone, but she was awake." James flinched, a ragged sound tearing from his throat. He had always been told she died on impact, that she felt no pain. That was the lie he had paid the police chief to tell him so he could sleep at night. "She was scared," Delilah whispered, tears dripping off her chin. But she wasn't scared for herself. She kept trying to reach for her purse. She grabbed my hand. Her grip was so strong. She looked right at me, and she said, "Tell him it wasn't his fault. Tell James not to let the silence win." Delilah looked at the man beside her. "I didn't know who James was. I didn't know who she was. The ambulance came, and they pushed me away. I tried to find the family, but my own life fell apart the next week. I thought I hallucinated it." James lifted his header, his eyes red and raw. "Not his fault," he repeated, the words breaking the chains of guilt that had been strangling him for half a decade.
He had blamed himself for the fight they had that morning, for the car he bought her, for not being there. He reached out, his hand shaking, and covered Delilah's hand with his own. It was the first time he had touched a woman with anything other than polite indifference in years. "Thank you," he choked out. "You didn't just save my daughter. You saved me." The moment of shared vulnerability was shattered by the sharp, piercing chime of the penthouse doorbell, a sound James had disabled for everyone except for one person. He stiffened, the vulnerability instantly evaporating, replaced by a cold, hard armor that terrified Delilah. "Get up," he said, his voice dropping to 0 degrees. "Fix your hair, do not speak unless spoken to." He stood up, pulling Delilah to her feet with a roughness that wasn't aggressive but urgent. "Who is it?" Delilah asked, wiping her eyes frantically. "The only person in this world who hates me more than I hate myself," James muttered. The double doors swung open and a woman stepped in. She was older, perhaps 60, but her face was pulled tight with surgery and bitterness. She wore a fur coat that cost more than Delilah's entire existence, and her eyes were like frozen diamonds. It was Evelyn, Lily's maternal grandmother, and the matriarch of the Vanderbilt fortune. "James," she said, the name sounding like a curse. "I hear you've hired another peasant to watch my granddaughter." Her gaze swept over Delilah, dismissing her instantly as furniture. "Where is she? I'm taking her to the Hamptons for the weekend. God knows she needs to be away from this gloom." James stepped in front of Delilah, blocking Evelyn's view. "She isn't going anywhere, Evelyn, and you aren't taking her." The tension in the room was sharp enough to cut glass. Evelyn laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, and who is going to stop me? This?" She pointed a gloved finger at Delilah. "I have filed for emergency custody, James. The courts think you are unstable. And looking at you, disheveled, crying in the hallway with the help, I think I'll win." Delilah felt the instinct to run, to hide, to disappear back into the anonymity of her poverty. But then she heard a small creak. Lily was standing at the end of the hallway, clutching her teddy bear, looking at her grandmother with terrified eyes. Evelyn didn't look like a loving grandmother. She looked like a hawk circling a mouse. "Come here, child," Evelyn commanded, snapping her fingers. Lily didn't move. She looked at James, who was frozen in a silent battle of wills with Evelyn, and then she looked at Delilah. "No," Lily whispered. Evelyn's face twisted in rage. "Excuse me." She stepped forward, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble. "I said, come here." She reached for Lily's arm. Delilah moved before she thought. It was a blur of instinct. One second she was behind James, the next she was kneeling in front of Lily, shielding the child with her body, her arms wrapped tight around the little girl. Evelyn's hand landed on Delilah's shoulder instead. "Don't touch her." Delilah's voice wasn't loud, but it was made of steel. She looked up at the billionaire socialite with eyes that burned with a fierce lioness protection. "She said no. And in this house, no means no. I don't care how much money you have." Evelyn gasped, recoiling as if she'd been slapped. "James, are you going to let this street rat talk to me like that?" James looked down at Delilah, at the curve of her back protecting his daughter, at the fire in her eyes that matched the fire he had once loved in his wife. A slow, dark smile spread across his face. "Actually, Evelyn," James said, stepping beside Delilah and placing a hand on her shoulder, solidifying the wall between the grandmother and the child, "I think she just gave you an order, and since she is the primary caregiver, her word is law. Get out of my house." Evelyn left, but not before promising a war that would burn Sterling Corp to the ground. The silence she left behind was heavy, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the hum of a new, fragile alliance. James looked at Delilah, who was still kneeling, trembling now that the adrenaline had faded. He didn't offer her money. He didn't offer her a promotion. He offered her something far more dangerous. "She will come back," James said, staring at the closed door. "She will dig into your past. She will try to destroy you to get to me." He crouched down, forcing Delilah to look him in the eye. "We need the bulletproof you. If we are going to win this custody battle, you cannot be Delilah, the divorced cleaner, anymore." He stood up, extending a hand to Lily, who took it, and then kept his hand open for Delilah. "You need to become someone untouchable. You need to become my fiancée." Delilah's jaw dropped. "What?" "Fake," James clarified quickly. though his eyes lingered on her lips for a second too long. A strategic engagement. It stops the custody claim. A stable home. A two-parent household. It's a business arrangement. Lily looked between them, her small hand pulling James's hand and Delilah's hand together until they touched. "Mommy stays?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "Yes, Lily," he said, his voice rough. "Mommy stays." That night, the penthouse felt different. The ghosts were still there, but they weren't screaming anymore. Delilah lay in her bed in the guest room. No, the fiancé's room, now, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing. Engaged to James Sterling. It was a lie, a play for the courts, but when he touched her hand, the heat had traveled all the way to her toes. She turned over, trying to sleep, but a glint of light from the window caught her eye. She got up, walking to the massive glass pane that overlooked the city. Down on the street, 30 floors below, a black sedan was parked. It had been there all day. She squinted. A figure was standing by the car, looking up. Even from this distance, she felt a chill of recognition. The posture. The cigarette. It looked like her ex-husband. But that was impossible. He was in Jersey. He didn't know where she was. Or did he? Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, making her jump. A blocked number. She picked it up, her hands shaking. "Hello?" Silence. Then a voice she hadn't heard in weeks. A voice that used to tell her she was worthless. "I saw the news, Delilah. Engaged to a billionaire. You think you can just run away with the jackpot? I know about the crash too, babe. And I know what you really did with the purse you found." The line went dead. Delilah dropped the phone, the blood draining from her face. She hadn't told James about the purse. She hadn't told him that she didn't just hold his wife's hand. She'd had taken something. And now the past was coming to collect.
The morning sun over Manhattan felt less like a new beginning and more like an interrogation lamp. James Sterling stood in the center of the living room, holding a velvet box as if it contained a live grenade. Delilah stood opposite him, her hands trembling by her sides, wearing a simple white dress that cost more than her ex-husband's annual salary. "This is strictly strategic," James said, his voice void of emotion, though his eyes betrayed a storm of conflict as they traced the line of her neck. "The press is downstairs. Evelyn has leaked rumors that I am unfit. This ring ends the conversation." He opened the box. Inside sat a 10-carat flawless diamond, a rock so heavy it looked like it could drown her. Delilah reached out, her breath hitching. As James slid the ring onto her finger, a jolt of electricity shot through them both, undeniable and terrifying. His hand lingered on hers, warm and calloused, contrasting sharply with the cold metal of the band. For a second, the air between them shimmered with the memory of the night before, the shared grief, the vulnerability. "It fits," Delilah whispered, looking up into his steel-gray eyes. "It's a shackle, Delilah," James replied, pulling his hand away abruptly, the walls of his heart slamming back up. "Don't forget that. You are playing a role. Do not start believing the script." He turned to leave, adjusting his cufflinks, but paused at the door. "And Delilah, if you have any other secrets, burn them, because if the press finds them, I can't protect you." He walked out, leaving her staring at the diamond that sparkled with the weight of a lie she was terrified to confess. She touched the pocket of her dress, feeling the cold, hard outline of the silver locket she had taken from his dying wife's hand 5 years ago, the locket David knew about. Delilah hid in the laundry room, the only place in the penthouse that felt safe, her hands shaking as she pulled the silver locket from her pocket. It was tarnished, dented from the crash, but the engraving was still clear. "To my beautiful Lily." She hadn't stolen it for money. The dying woman had pressed it into her bloody palm, gasping, "Take it. Don't let James see it. Promise me." Delilah had obeyed a dying wish, panicked and confused, and had hidden it away in a box of old receipts for 5 years. But why? Why couldn't James see it? She was about to pry it open, to finally see what was inside, when her phone buzzed. It was David. "Nice rock, babe. I'm outside the building. Bring me the locket and $50K cash, or I go to the reporters standing next to me and tell them the new Mrs. Sterling is a grave robber." Delilah's blood ran cold. She couldn't tell James. He would think she was a thief. He would think she let his wife die to steal jewelry. It would destroy the fragile trust they'd built, and worse, it would lose her Lily.
She shoved the locket back into her pocket and ran to the service elevator. She had to buy time. She didn't have $50,000, but she had the engagement ring. No, she couldn't sell that. She had her own wedding ring, the thin, cheap gold band from David that she still kept in her purse out of habit. It was worth nothing, but maybe she could beg. She burst out onto the side street, the wind whipping her hair. David was leaning against a dirty brick wall, smoking, looking smug and dangerous. "You look expensive," he sneered, flicking the cigarette at her feet. "Where's my money?" "I don't have it, David," Delilah pleaded, stepping back. "Please, I'm just trying to survive. Don't ruin this." David laughed, grabbing her wrist, his grip bruising. "Survive? You're living in a penthouse while I'm dodging loan sharks. Give me the locket." "No!" Delilah screamed, pulling away. "It's not mine to give." David raised his hand to strike her, a reflex from their dark past. But before the blow could land, a shadow fell over them. A massive suited security guard, James, head of security, stepped out from the alley, catching David's fist in midair. "Mr. Sterling prefers his fiancée unbruised," the guard growled. David paled, yanking his hand back. "You tell your boss she's a thief," David shouted, as he backed away, pointing a shaking finger at Delilah. "Ask her what she took from the crash. Ask her!" He turned and ran, disappearing into the city crowd. Delilah stood frozen, her heart hammering. The guard looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Are you okay, Miss Ross?" "Don't tell him," Delilah whispered, grabbing the guard's arm. "Please, it's not what he thinks." The guard paused, then nodded slowly. "I didn't see anything." But Delilah knew that in James Sterling's world, nothing stayed hidden forever. The Sterling Foundation Gala was the event of the season, a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Delilah stood at the top of the marble staircase, her arm linked through James's. She wore a dress of midnight blue silk that clung to her curves like liquid water, her hair cascading in soft waves. She looked like a queen, but she felt like an imposter. "Smile," James murmured against her ear, his breath sending a shiver down her spine. "Evelyn is watching." He was right. Across the room, the grandmother stood like a vulture in red velvet, holding a glass of champagne, her eyes narrowing as she saw them. James placed his hand on the small of Delilah's back, his touch possessing and protective, guiding her down the stairs. The cameras flashed, a blinding wall of light. "Is it true you're engaged? When is the wedding?" James pulled Delilah closer, looking directly into the camera lens. "As soon as possible," he lied smoothly. "I've never been happier." He looked down at Delilah, and for a terrifying moment, the lie faded from his eyes. He looked at her with a raw intensity that made the room disappear. "Dance with me," he commanded, not waiting for an answer. He swept her onto the floor, his body moving in perfect sync with hers. Under the crystal chandeliers, holding the man she was deceiving, Delilah felt a tear slip down her cheek. "Why are you crying?" James whispered, wiping the tear away with his thumb. "Because I'm happy," she lied. "Don't lie to me, Delilah." James said, his voice dropping. "I can handle anything but lies." He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead. "I know about David," he whispered. Delilah froze in his arms. The music seemed to stop. "I know he came to see you. I know he threatened you." He looked into her eyes, searching. "Did you kill her?"
James didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs, sprinting down 3 flights before realizing the futility of it and bursting through the emergency exit into the alleyway behind the hotel. The rain had returned, a torrential downpour that washed away the glamour of the gala, leaving only the gritty reality of the New York streets. He stood in the middle of the road, his tuxedo soaked instantly, scanning the darkness for the flash of midnight blue silk. His chest heaved, not from exertion, but from the crushing weight of the truth he had just learned. Delilah hadn't just protected his daughter, she had protected his ego, his heart, and his memory of a woman who hadn't loved him. He clutched the locket in his fist, the sharp edges digging into his palm, a physical reminder of the pain he had caused the only person who had ever been truly loyal to him. "Delilah!" he screamed, his voice tearing through the sound of the traffic, but the city swallowed his cry. He pulled out his phone, tracking the GPS on the engagement ring, the shackle he had put on her. The dot was stationary, 3 blocks away, in a park near the river. It wasn't moving. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced his lungs. He began to run, his dress shoes slipping on the wet pavement, driven by a fear he hadn't felt since the night of the accident. He wasn't running to save a nanny. He was running to save the only future he wanted. Delilah sat on a rusted swing in the empty playground, the expensive silk dress ruined by the mud, her bare feet bleeding from the run. She shivered violently, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt numb. It was over. She had lost Lily. She had lost James. And now she was back to being nothing. A shadow detached itself from the trees, a figure she knew too well. David emerged, smelling of cheap whiskey and malice. "I told you, babe, you can't play dress-up forever. The clock always strikes midnight." He stepped into the dim light of the street lamp, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. It clicked open, the sound terrifyingly loud in the silence. "You cost me 50 grand tonight," David growled, his eyes dark with desperation. "You think you can just walk away? Give me the ring. It's the least you owe me for the trouble." Delilah looked at the ring, the diamond mocking her with its brilliance. She tried to pull it off, but her fingers were swollen from the cold. "I'm trying," she sobbed, tugging at the band. "It's stuck." David lunged, grabbing her hand. "Then I'll cut it off." Delilah screamed, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for the pain. But instead, she heard a sickening crunch. David shouted, flying backward, as if hit by a truck. James Sterling stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a demonic fury. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a force of nature. He didn't say a word. He grabbed David by the collar of his jacket and slammed him against the metal pole of the swing set. "You touch her again," James whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble, "and I will buy the prison you go to just to turn off the heating." David scrambled away, terrified by the monster he had unleashed, and vanished into the night, leaving James and Delilah alone in the rain. James turned to Delilah, the rage vanishing instantly, replaced by a desperate tenderness. He fell to his knees in the mud, ruining his suit, and pulled her into his arms. She flinched, expecting anger, but he held her as if she were made of glass. "I'm sorry," he choked out, burying his face in her wet hair. "I'm so sorry, Delilah. I read the note." Delilah froze. "James, You protected me," he interrupted, pulling back to cup her face with his hands. "You carried that secret for 5 years to save a man you didn't even know. You are the most selfless, incredible woman I've ever met, and I am a fool." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket. Delilah watched, holding her breath. James looked at the silver object that had caused so much pain. "This was a lie. My marriage was a lie. The only real thing in this family is you and Lily." He stood up, pulling Delilah with him, and walked to the edge of the river. With a powerful swing of his arm, he threw the locket into the dark water. They watched it splash and disappear, taking the ghost of the past with it. "But the note," Delilah whispered. "The baby. She said Lily isn't—" James turned to her, his eyes fierce. "Lily is my daughter. Blood doesn't make a father, Delilah. Love does. I chose her the day she was born, and I'm choosing her now. Just like I'm choosing you." He kissed her, a kiss that tasted of rain and redemption, sealing a promise that no DNA test could ever break. They returned to the penthouse at dawn, hand in hand, wet, exhausted, but invincible. The elevator doors opened to reveal Evelyn sitting in the living room, sipping tea as if she owned the place. She looked up, her lip curling in disgust as she saw their ruined clothes. Pathetic, she spat. I've already called my lawyers. After that stunt at the gala, I'll have custody of Lily by noon. You are unfit, James, and your whore is a thief. James walked forward, his stride confident, the fear gone. He stopped in front of the grandmother who had tormented them for years. You're done, Evelyn, James said quietly. You want to talk about scandals? Let's talk about your daughter. Evelyn's eyes widened. What are you talking about? James leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she and Delilah could hear. I know about the affair. I know why she was in the car that night. She wasn't coming home to me. Evelyn's face went white. She knew. She had always known. If you try to take Lily, James continued, his voice hard as steel, I will release everything. I will drag the Vanderbilt name through the mud until no country club in the world will let you in. You will lose your reputation, your legacy, and your granddaughter. Evelyn stared at him, trembling with rage and defeat. She was to Delilah, who stood tall beside him, no longer the maid, but the queen. Evelyn set her teacup down with a clatter. She stood up, gathered her fur coat, and walked to the elevator. You have her stubbornness, she hissed as the doors closed, admitting her final defeat. The penthouse was silent. The war was over. James turned to Delilah. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. The morning sun was breaking over the skyline, painting the room in gold. Delilah, James said, his voice shaking slightly. The contract is void. Delilah's heart dropped. What? I fired you, James said, taking a step closer. I can't employ you anymore, because I can't be in love with my employee. He took her hand, the one with the massive diamond still stuck on her finger. This ring was a lie yesterday. It was a strategy. I twisted it gently, wiping a smudge of mud from the stone. But I want to make it true. I don't want a fake fiancé. I want a partner. I want a mother for Lily. I want you. Lily ran into the room, rubbing her sleep from her eyes, dragging her teddy bear. She stopped, looking at her dad and Delilah. Mommy staying? She asked, her voice small. James picked Lily up, holding her close, then pulled Delilah into the hug, completing the circle. Yes, baby, James smiled, tears shining in his eyes. Mommy is staying forever. Delilah buried her face in James's shoulder, feeling the warmth of the family she had found in the wreckage of her life. She had lost a husband who didn't love her, but she had found a king who would burn the world down for her. If you love this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Folktale CEO. We post new heartbreaking and heartwarming stories every single day. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next drama.